When I was a kid, the attic always scared me more than the basement ever did. I don't really know why. Most people are afraid of basements, but there was something about our attic that got under my skin. If I had to guess, I'd say it was because our attic wasn't what you're probably picturing. For starters, it was surprisingly spacious. Most attics are cramped and claustrophobic, which makes sense, but ours wasn't like that. It was built in a way where you never had to crouch. You could stand up straight anywhere up there. You'd think that meant we used it more often, like anyone would use extra space, but we didn't. I'm not really sure why, but my parents treated it like a glorified storage room. That was its only purpose. Looking back now, they honestly avoided it whenever they could. The other thing about it was the layout. It had all these strange nooks and crannies built into it. The space was broken up by uneven beams and slight changes in elevation, almost like someone had designed a maze and then forgotten to finish it properly. The beams weren't uniform. Some were thicker than others, some thinner, and there was no pattern to where they appeared. You couldn't stand in one spot and see the entire attic. There was always something blocking your view. And the flooring was a nightmare. The boards weren't even, and there were exposed joists in places. If you weren't careful, you could genuinely hurt yourself up there. My dad used to joke that one day one of us would slip, fall through the insulation, and punch a hole straight through the ceiling below. So you can probably imagine why a place like that would terrify a little kid. What bothered me most was that maze, like quality. I hated not being able to see the whole space at once. Every time I went up there, I felt like someone was standing just out of sight, hidden behind one of the beams, waiting for me to move. Anyway, what I'm about to tell you happened so long ago that most of my memories from that time are fuzzy. But this one isn't, for some reason. This memory is sharp. It sticks out like a thorn in what was otherwise a really good childhood. It happened during the week. I remember that because I had school. I don't know exactly how old I was, but I was in middle school. I woke up one morning and noticed my feet were dirty. The bottoms were gray and grimy, and there was this thin layer of grit between my toes. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, just staring at them, trying to figure out how that was possible. I hadn't gone outside the night before. I hadn't done anything unusual. I'd gone to bed like normal. Fallen asleep, that was it. Being a kid, I didn't dwell on it too much. I just washed my feet in the bathtub and moved on with my day. But it didn't stop there. A few days later, I found a box in my room that definitely hadn't been there before. It was one of those small cardboard boxes filled with old photographs, the kind my parents kept stored in the attic. I had absolutely no memory of bringing it downstairs. When I asked my mom about it, she assumed I'd been rummaging around up there for some reason. I told her I hadn't. She didn't seem worried. She just carried the box back upstairs like it wasn't a big deal. Then it happened again. I woke up and found an old lamp sitting on my desk. It was this ugly brass thing I vaguely recognized from the attic. And this time I knew I hadn't brought it down. I would have remembered carrying a lamp through the house in the middle of the night. That's when everything started connecting. The dirty feet, the photographs, the lamp. I wasn't just sleepwalking. I was sleepwalking to the attic. The realization didn't scare me immediately. It just felt wrong. The idea that I was navigating that maze of beams and uneven boards in total darkness, completely unconscious, was unsettling. I told my parents, and they reacted exactly how you'd expect. They said sleepwalking was normal. Lots of kids did it. I'd probably grow out of it. They weren't dismissive exactly, but they weren't alarmed either. To them, it was just a phase. To me, it didn't feel like that. After the next incident, I started dreading bedtime. I'd lie awake for hours, fighting sleep because I was terrified of what might happen once I wasn't aware anymore. Of course, I couldn't stay awake forever, and every morning the first thing I'd do was check my feet. If they were clean, it had been a good night. If they were dirty, it hadn't. Most mornings they were clean, but those few times they weren't, those are the mornings I still remember. There was no denying it anymore. I was going up that regularly, and the worst part was that I hadn't remembered to go. For all I knew, I was spending more time in the attic than in my own bed. The fear during that period was different from anything I'd ever felt before. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't shock. It was this slow, creeping dread that never fully went away. And then one night, it got worse. I woke up, except it wasn't me. It was still dark. It took a few seconds for my brain to catch up that something had happened. I wasn't lying down. I was standing. That was the first thing I understood. I was upright, completely still, surrounded by darkness. For a moment, I didn't even know where I was, and then it hit me. I was in the attic. The fear that flooded through me was so intense I could barely breathe. I couldn't see anything, not the beams, not the boxes, not the hatch, just absolute black, and I had no idea where in the attic I was standing. I froze. It felt like sleep paralysis multiplied by 100. I knew the layout vaguely, but only from memory. I knew there were obstacles everywhere. Trying to find the hatch in total darkness felt almost impossible. But I couldn't just stay there, so I started moving, slowly, carefully. Every step felt wrong. I was so scared I started crying, but silently. The tears just ran down my face. I felt like if I made too much noise, something would hear me, because I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I don't know where that thought came from, but it was overwhelming. It felt like something else was up there, something further back in the dark, and then I heard it, a soft thud, somewhere behind me. It sounded like a footstep, or someone shifting their weight on the floorboards. I kept moving, but I heard it again, and then once more, each time from a slightly different spot. At that point, I was completely convinced there was something else in the attic with me. I don't know how long it took to find the hatch. It felt endless, but eventually I did. I climbed down and went straight to my parents' room. I was fully crying by then. I couldn't hold it together anymore. I told them everything, that I'd woken up standing in the dark, that I'd had to find my way back, that I heard someone up there with me. I expected my dad to jump out of bed and grab something to defend us, but he didn't. They didn't really take it seriously. My mom hugged me and said sleepwalking can feel scary, but it isn't dangerous. My dad offered to put a lock on the hatch if that would make me feel better. I said yes immediately. But I knew what I heard. I begged them to at least check the attic. My dad eventually agreed. As I watched him climb the ladder, part of me genuinely thought he wouldn't come back down. But not even 2 minutes later, he was back. He said there was nothing up there, told me to go back to bed. So I did, but lying there that night was worse than anything that had happened before. After that, the sleepwalking stopped. I don't know what I would have done if it hadn't, and I've never fully accepted the explanation. I know sleepwalking is real. I know it happens. There's nothing supernatural about it. But there's this part of me that can't let it go. The fact that I always went to the attic, never anywhere else. The fact that I could somehow navigate that maze without ever hurting myself. And most of all, that night, waking up standing in the dark, the sounds, I still believe something was up there with me. I really do. What it was, I have no idea. I've brought it up to my parents several times over the years. They always give me the same answers. Sometimes it feels like they don't even want to think about it. And I doubt I'll ever get the answer I'm looking for. 9:28. This happened when I was 14 or 15. My family lived in an old house that had been passed down for generations. My dad grew up there, and so did his parents before him. I don't live there anymore, but I still think about what I'm about to tell you. Like most houses, it had an attic. It was basically a graveyard for things nobody wanted to deal with: old furniture, boxes of who knows what, and Christmas decorations. That last one was the only reason anyone ever went up there. Once before the holidays, and once after to put everything back. This happened around Christmas, but Christmas itself doesn't really matter to the story. That year, my dad decided I was finally old enough to grab the decorations myself. He gave me a whole rundown, which boxes to look for. Something about the lights being in a separate container near the back wall. I nodded along like I was paying attention. I wasn't. Not really. We finished talking, and he sent me up to the attic. I climbed the ladder and pulled the little chain to turn on the light. The bulb flickered for a second before fully coming on, casting that dull yellow glow over everything. I remember looking around and realizing I genuinely couldn't remember the last time I'd been up there. And then it hit me. I had absolutely no idea what my dad had told me to grab. None of it stuck. Not the boxes. Not the location. Nothing. And there was no way I was going back downstairs to ask him to repeat himself. My dad had this thing about that. If you made him say something twice, he'd get legitimately pissed. So instead of admitting I hadn't been paying attention, I just started opening random boxes that looked like they might have Christmas decorations inside. I moved stuff around for probably 20 minutes. By the end of it, the attic was a disaster. Boxes pulled out. Lids half open. Random junk stacked in piles. I did eventually find the Christmas stuff, which at least spared me the embarrassment of going downstairs empty-handed. But the place was completely disorganized. I made 4 or 5 trips up and down the ladder, carrying everything into the living room. Once I was done, I climbed back up one last time to make sure I hadn't missed anything important. I already knew I was going to have to reorganize everything I'd just torn apart, which I wasn't exactly excited about. As I stood there looking around, mentally preparing myself for the mess, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. In one of the back corners, tucked behind some of the stuff I'd shifted around, there was a box. It wasn't cardboard. It was black, sturdy, the kind of thing you'd store important documents in, maybe even fireproof. Despite how solid it looked, it somehow felt older than everything else up there. Being a curious kid, I opened it. Inside were papers, dozens of them, not just a handful, an alarming amount. Notebooks, loose pages, a few hand-drawn maps, even sheets of what looked like music, and every single page was covered in handwriting. The maps, the notebooks, even the sheet music, all of it filled edge to edge. I started flipping through them, trying to figure out what I was looking at. The handwriting was messy and difficult to read at first, but the longer I stared at it, the more my eyes adjusted. None of the pages were dated, but they seemed stacked in some kind of order, older entries toward the top, newer ones near the bottom. I was so absorbed by it that I told myself I wouldn't go downstairs until I'd read everything. The earliest entries were boring. Weather notes, lists of household tasks, random thoughts about the day. It felt like a messy diary. And it didn't take long for me to realize whoever wrote it had lived in that house at some point. But as I kept reading, it changed. The handwriting grew more frantic, less legible. That was the first sign. The second was the content. Whoever wrote those pages became obsessed with the attic. They kept measuring it over and over. They documented the dimensions repeatedly, comparing the attic's measurements to the footprint of the house below. According to their calculations, the attic was smaller than it should have been. There was missing space, several feet along one wall that couldn't be accounted for. They went into obsessive detail about that wall. Cracks, indentations, subtle marks. Every square inch described like it mattered more than anything else. The later entries were worse. Based on what I was reading, the writer had started spending hours in the attic, sometimes even sleeping up there. They wrote about hearing sounds from behind that missing section of wall. Scratching, breathing, there were even timestamps, 2:14 a.m., scratching for approximately 3 minutes. The more I read, the more it felt like I was watching someone unravel in real time. It wasn't coherent. It wasn't rational. It was a first-hand account of someone spiraling, and I didn't believe a word of it. At least not at first, but then the final pages weren't even sentences anymore, just tally marks, rows and rows of them. Counting something, and then it stopped. Either the writer had stopped, or that was simply as far as the record went. By the time I finished, my hands were shaking. I wanted to shove everything back into the box, close it, go downstairs, and erase the entire thing from my mind. But before I did that, I had to look. My eyes drifted toward the wall the writer had been fixated on. And the second I noticed actual marks in it, I felt sick. Small indents, thin cracks, subtle lines in the wood that seemed to match the descriptions almost perfectly. It was a kind of fear I'd never experienced before. The closest I can describe it is the sensation of being watched, but from multiple angles at once. I could picture the writer clawing at that wall in some obsessive frenzy. It felt like he was still up there with me. Suddenly, I didn't want to be in that attic for another second. I grabbed the black box and went straight to my dad. He was just as confused as I was. He had no idea what it meant. He said it definitely wasn't his father's handwriting, which meant whoever wrote those entries had lived there before my grandfather. The problem was, his parents were gone, and he knew nothing about the people who had owned the house before him. My dad went up to investigate, and to my surprise, he took me with him. I didn't argue. I felt safer with him there. I stood off to the side while he examined the wall more carefully than I had, using the pages as a whole. After a few minutes, he went quiet. I thought he was giving up. Instead, he turned to me and said he was going to rip the wall down. I was honestly shocked, but I didn't try to stop him. He grabbed tools from the garage and started tearing into it. And the writer had been right. There was space back there. A lot of space, several feet deep, running the entire length of the wall. But that wasn't the worst part. The walls of the hidden space were covered in markings, black lines, symbols, shapes I didn't recognize. They covered almost every surface. I don't really know how to describe them properly. They didn't look like writing. They looked intentional, deliberate, like they meant something. And then we realized something worse. There was no other entrance to that hidden space, no crawlway, no hatch, nothing. So how had anyone ever gotten in there to make those markings? My dad and I just stood there, overwhelmed. Eventually, after the initial shock wore off, we checked the space thoroughly. There was nothing inside, no furniture, no objects, just the markings. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. The more we talked about it, the less sense it made. At one point, my dad pointed out something I hadn't considered. Whoever wrote those pages, whoever had been that obsessive, didn't seem like the type of person who would carefully organize everything into a neat little box and tuck it away. Compulsive behavior doesn't usually end with tidy archival work. That meant someone else had gathered the writings. My dad's expression changed when that realization hit him. It was this unreadable mix of sadness and confusion. After a long pause, he said it must have been his father. My grandfather must have found the writings at some point and collected them. There wasn't much else to do after that. Years later, my dad admitted that the idea of his own father hiding something like that from him and not knowing why would always bother him. And I don't blame him. As for me, I still don't know what to make of it. It happened a long time ago. Most days I don't think about it, but if I let my mind sit on it too long, I can still freak myself out. There's no clean explanation. I used to think the writer had been the one who marked up that hidden space, that they were just unstable, but there were details in those pages that someone could only know after the wall was already up. And with the wall up, there was no way into that space. It doesn't make sense. When we eventually moved out, my dad wouldn't let me keep the box. For all I know, it's still sitting up there. All I know is this is a mystery I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. 19, 10, I've been a smoker longer than I care to admit. 20, 3 years now, give or take. At this point, it's less of a habit and more of a ritual. Something to keep my hands busy, something that marks the end of a day. I refuse to smoke inside, though. My parents were the same way. Even my dad only smoked cigars on special occasions, and always outside. I inherited this house from them about 4 years ago when they finally moved down to Florida. They talked about it forever. I think they just needed to know the house would stay in the family before they could actually leave. I was divorced, living in a depressing apartment that felt more like a storage unit than a home. So the timing worked out. My only complaint now is that the house feels too big, which sounds ridiculous until you realize it's a three-story colonial and I live alone. There's also a big backyard, probably close to an acre if you include the wooded section, and I've gotten into the habit of taking these late night walks while I smoke. It's peaceful out there. There aren't any neighbors close enough to bother me, and the only light comes from my house. Most nights, it's just me, the crickets, and whatever's rustling around in the trees. I usually do a full loop around the property line. Takes about 10 minutes if I'm not rushing. It's kind of become my version of meditation, or maybe just my excuse to smoke in peace. There's one thing you need to know about the house. It's incredibly old. Creaky floors, drafty windows, all of that. It's practically impossible to walk around inside without making noise. Even a single step echoes through the place. There's also an attic, accessed by a pull-down ladder in the upstairs hallway. It's basically a big storage space. I only ever go up there to grab decorations or stash some of my parents' stuff I can't bring myself to throw away. There's a tiny window up there, too, maybe a foot wide, original to the house. It overlooks the backyard and honestly looks out of place compared to the rest of the exterior. I've looked up at that window hundreds of times during my walks. It's never once caught my attention. Until about 3 weeks ago, I was halfway through my usual loop, cigarette in hand, when I happened to glance up at the house. I don't even know why. I wasn't thinking about the attic. My eyes just drifted upward, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw something move behind that little window. I stopped walking, just stood there in the middle of the backyard, staring up at the attic. The window was dark. Of course it was. There's no light up there unless you bring a flashlight. But I was almost positive I'd seen movement. A shape passing in front of the glass. Something shifting in the darkness. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Probably just a reflection, a cloud, maybe a bat flying past. I finished my cigarette, went back inside, and didn't think about it again. The next night, though, I saw it again. This time I was sure. There was definitely something moving up there. Not a reflection, not a trick of the light. Something was in my attic. My first thought was an animal. Squirrels get into old houses all the time. I wouldn't have been surprised if there was a gap somewhere in the eaves. But then I started thinking about what kind of animal would be big enough to see from that distance, and I didn't like any of the answers I came up with. I went back inside and stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at the hallway where the attic access is. I didn't hear any scratching, no scurrying. Actually, I didn't hear anything at all, which somehow made it worse. I really didn't want to go up there, but I didn't have a choice. If something was in my attic, I needed to know. So reluctantly, I turned on my phone flashlight and pulled down the ladder. The layout of the attic meant I'd have to go up blind. If something was lurking just beyond the opening, I wouldn't see it until it was too late. I climbed slowly, trying to convince myself I wasn't terrified. But I was, and my fear was almost immediately justified. I was not prepared for what I saw up there. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person either. The attic was destroyed, and I don't mean messy. I mean completely wrecked. Every box overturned, every bin dumped out, but that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the black paint, or at least what looked like black paint. It was smeared across every wall, the ceiling too, thick, uneven, almost chunky, and it looked wet, not just glossy, wet, like it had been smeared minutes ago. In some places, it was still dripping. I was 100% sure it was fresh. That first glimpse freaked me out so badly, I almost fell off the ladder. I don't know why, but seeing that dripping paint hit something deep in me. I felt like I couldn't breathe. My brain immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion. Someone was in my house. I did one quick sweep of the attic with my flashlight, just to make sure no one was standing there. Then I practically fell down the ladder, trying to get back to the second floor. Within seconds, my fear turned into anger. I was going to find this person, and I was going to defend myself. I tore through the house, checking every room, closet, bathroom, under beds, but I didn't find anything, and the more I looked, the more discouraged I got. The adrenaline started wearing off too, and the fear came back, stronger this time. I cleared the whole house and went back upstairs to my bedroom, thinking maybe I'd missed something. But I hadn't, and the moment I paused to catch my breath, I heard it. 2 heavy thumps, then the sound of something being dragged across the floor. It was directly above me, the attic. How stupid of me. Whoever was up there had never left. They'd probably been hiding behind one of those overturned boxes the whole time. I don't know where the courage came from, but something in me snapped. This was my parents' house, and whoever was up there had violated it. Before I could talk myself out of it, I ran downstairs, grabbed the biggest knife I could find in the kitchen, and went back up. And I was ready to use it. I pulled the ladder down again. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely grip the rungs. But I forced myself to climb, and then I just started screaming. I burst through the attic opening, yelling at the top of my lungs, waving the knife around like a complete lunatic. Part of it was anger, but most of it was fear. I stomped through the attic, flipping boxes, screaming the entire time. There was no one there, I was sure of it. The attic isn't big. It's just one open space. There was no way to hide. But there was something weird. It seemed like every ounce of anger platform. Everywhere, long, deep gouges carved into the wooden beams and floorboards, like something with claws had been tearing at them. The black paint was still there, but the scratches were nailed over it. After that, I was done. I ran downstairs, locked myself in the first floor bathroom, and called 911. The police showed up about 15 minutes later. 2 officers went up to check the attic, while I stayed downstairs at the third. When they came back down, all they said was that the attic was empty. They also couldn't find any gaps or openings. So according to them, whoever vandalized it must have left through the house. I told them that was impossible. The house is so creaky that even the slightest step makes noise. I would have heard someone leaving, even from another floor. But there was nothing else they could do, so they left. It's been 3 weeks since that night. Nothing else has happened. So I guess I'm supposed to believe some homeless person snuck into my attic, trashed it, and left without me noticing. But I don't believe that. I really don't. I don't know what to make of any of this, but I know it wasn't just some random person. It was something worse. I still haven't gone back up there, not even to clean the paint, and honestly, I don't know what to do.